The waiting room at Mercy General had 43 chairs and every single one of them was full. Nadine Okafor stood at the triage window for the third time in 40 minutes. Her left hand pressed flat against the glass partition. Her right hand still held the plastic bag she had carried from the parking garage, a bag that contained one pair of reading glasses, a travel-size bottle of lotion, and a small wooden cross her mother had pressed into her palm in 1987 and told her never to put down. She had not put it down. The nurse behind the glass did not look up when Nadine approached. She was typing. She'd been typing the first time. She had been typing the second time. She was still typing now, and the sound of it, the dry mechanical click of the keys, filled the space between them like a wall someone had decided was permanent. "Excuse me," Nadine said. "I called ahead. My name is Okafor. I was told there would be a bed." The nurse looked up then. She was a woman in her mid-40s with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and a lanyard that held a badge Nadine could not read from her angle. She looked at Nadine the way people sometimes look at something that has appeared in a place it doesn't belong. A single sweep. Fast. "There are no beds available," she said. "I already told you." "You told me 20 minutes ago," Nadine said. "I was told by admissions that a cardiac patient with a referral from Dr. Elias Morrow had priority placement." "Morrow's patients go through cardiology intake, not emergency. You're in the wrong place." "Cardiology intake told me to come here. They said the bed assignment was handled through this desk." The nurse set both hands flat on her keyboard and looked at Nadine with a patience that was not patience at all. It was performance. "Ma'am, there are no beds. You can wait or you can come back tomorrow." Tomorrow. Nadine stood there for a moment. She did not raise her voice. She did not let her face collapse. She simply stood, and anyone watching from across that waiting room would have seen a black woman in a grey wool coat, standing very still, holding a plastic bag, and they would not have known what they were actually looking at. But before we get to what happened at 12:47, when a man in green surgical scrubs ran the length of that main corridor so fast that 3 nurses stopped and stared, let me take you back. Because what walked through those doors that morning did not begin at those doors. Not even close. Nadine Okafor was 61 years old. She had been born in Lagos, Nigeria, and brought to the United States at age 11 by a mother named Comfort, who cleaned offices at night and studied nursing textbooks during the day in a 2-bedroom apartment in Silver Spring, Maryland. Comfort Okafor never became a nurse. The licensing exam cost $90 in 1979. And there were years when $90 was a mortgage payment and a grocery run and a bus pass combined, and Comfort always put the $90 toward the things that kept the apartment warm, and Nadine in school shoes, but she kept the textbooks. They sat on a shelf in the living room, Gray's Anatomy and Tabor's Cyclopedic, and a battered copy of Merck's manual, with the spine held together by a rubber band. The shelf was a piece of pressed wood Comfort had found at a church sale, painted white twice and still showing the original brown through the enamel in a thin line along the top edge. The books had been expensive when new and were not new when Comfort bought them from a nursing school student who was dropping out, but they were intact, and their pages were clean, and Comfort had carried them home on 2 buses with a bag of groceries balanced against her hip and set them on the painted shelf with a care that Nadine, watching from the doorway, understood even at 11 as something close to ceremony. From the time she could reach them, Nadine was allowed to open them and ask questions. Not the simplified answers adults give children, the real answers, the names of the valves, the sequence of the chambers, the vocabulary of the body spoken aloud in a Silver Spring apartment at night while a child sat cross-legged on a linoleum floor and her mother pointed to diagrams and said the words slowly and then faster and said them again until Nadine could say them back. Mitral, tricuspid, aortic. The left ventricle does the heaviest work. It pushes blood the farthest. Comfort said this last part as though it mattered separately. And it did, though Nadine did not know yet exactly why. She learned, without knowing she was learning, that the human body was a system of extraordinary logic, and that logic was something no one could take from you once you had it inside you. Nadine did not become a doctor. She became a hospital administrator. She spent 33 years in healthcare management, starting as a billing coordinator at Howard University Hospital and rising through a series of positions she had earned one at a time with no patron and no shortcut to become the chief operating officer of the Mid-Atlantic Health Consortium, a non-profit network that oversaw the administrative operations of 14 hospitals across 3 states. Mercy General was one of those 14 hospitals. She was here today not as a patient and not as a visitor. She was here as the person her board had sent to conduct a surprise operational audit following 3 consecutive quarters of patient satisfaction scores in the lowest regional percentile, a 16% spike in admissions errors, and a complaint from a cardiology department physician who had written the board a 7-page letter about intake procedures that he described, in the letter's final paragraph, as a catastrophic failure of institutional dignity. Dr. Elias Morrow had written that letter. Elias Morrow, head of the cardiology department, had been at Mercy General for 19 years. He was a precise man who wore the same style of Oxford shirt in 4 different colours and who had, in the past decade, trained 11 cardiologists who now held positions at teaching hospitals across the country. He did not write letters like that one. He had never written a letter like that one. When he finally did, the board of the Mid-Atlantic Health Consortium read it in a room that went very quiet, and then the board chair had called Nadine and asked her to go see what was happening at Mercy General, and to do it without announcing herself, because announced audits told you what a hospital wanted you to see, and Nadine needed to see what it actually was. So she had driven herself. She had worn the grey wool coat and sensible shoes and carried the plastic bag with her mother's wooden cross inside it, because she carried it everywhere, had carried it for 34 years, and she had walked into Mercy General's emergency intake at 9:45 in the morning as an ordinary person, which was, in her experience, the most revealing disguise of all. The morning had confirmed the letter. She had watched a man in his 70s wait 2 hours and 40 minutes with visible chest pain before anyone called him forward. She had watched a woman with a sleeping infant on her lap ask 3 times for a translator and be told each time that one would be called. The translator never came. She had watched the man with chest pain finally reach the window, watched him describe his symptoms with one hand pressed to his sternum, and watched Hartwell hand him a form and a pen and point to a row of chairs without making full eye contact. The transaction completed in under 40 seconds. She had watched the way Hartwell's posture changed when a white-coated physician appeared at the window. The straightened spine, the helpful voice, the eye contact that materialized out of nowhere as if a switch had been found. Nadine had written everything down in a small notebook she kept in her coat pocket, the same kind of composition notebook she had used since graduate school. Black cover, college ruled, spine not broken. She had 42 pages of notes from that morning alone. Now it was 12:31 in the afternoon, and she was standing at the window for the 3rd time, and Hartwell had just told her to come back tomorrow. Nadine did not move. "I'd like to speak with the department supervisor," she said. "The supervisor is in a meeting." "I'll wait." Hartwell's expression did not change, but something behind it shifted. She had expected Nadine to leave. People who were dismissed usually left. "It may be a long wait." "That's fine," Nadine said. She turned and walked back to the row of chairs along the east wall and sat down in the one nearest the window and placed her plastic bag on her lap and opened her notebook to a fresh page. She wrote down the time, 12:33. She wrote down the conversation verbatim as close as memory allowed, which was very close. She had a memory for spoken language that her mother had always called a gift, and that Nadine understood, more accurately, as a discipline. You paid attention because attention was a form of respect. You retained what you witnessed because forgetting was a form of abandonment. These were not her own formulations. They were her mother's, said in a kitchen in Silver Spring, over a table covered with nursing textbook pages and school permission slips, and the quiet arithmetic of a household that had more obligations than income and refused to be defeated by either. At 12:39, a man came through the double doors from the interior corridor. He was tall, with dark hair going grey at the temples, wearing green surgical scrubs and a stethoscope looped around his neck, and he was moving fast, not quite running but close, with the focused directional energy of someone who has received information that requires immediate response. Dr. Elias Morrow had been in a department heads meeting on the 4th floor when his administrative assistant sent him a text that read, "I think someone from the consortium is in the lobby. Patient log shows a referral from you to a Nadine Okafor. He had not referred a Nadine Okafor to emergency intake. He had, however, recognised the name immediately and understood within approximately 4 seconds what it meant and what it meant for this hospital and, more specifically, for the intake procedures he had spent 19 months trying to get corrected and had finally, in desperation, put into a letter. He came through the double doors at 12:39 and looked across the waiting room and saw a woman in a grey wool coat sitting against the east wall with a notebook open on her knee, writing. He walked to her directly. "Ms. Okafor," he said. Nadine looked up from her notebook. She did not look surprised. She closed the notebook and placed it back in her coat pocket and stood, and they were the same height, and she extended her hand, and he took it. "Dr. Morrow," she said, "how long have you been here?" "Since 9:45. He absorbed that. His jaw moved once. "I'll be honest with you. I'm not sure whether to be grateful or mortified." "Both seem appropriate," she said. He almost smiled. "Let me show you the department." "In a moment," Nadine said. She turned back toward the triage window where Hartwell had been watching this exchange with an expression that had gone through several phases and landed somewhere that was not quite recognition but was adjacent to it. Nadine walked to the window. She reached into the plastic bag she had been carrying all morning and set her Mid-Atlantic Health Consortium identification card on the counter, the one with the navy stripe and the gold seal, and her name and title printed beneath a photograph taken 4 years ago when her hair had still been mostly dark. She placed it with the card facing up. She did not say anything. She did not need to. Hartwell looked at the card. She looked at Nadine. She looked at Dr. Morrow standing 6 feet behind Nadine's shoulder. The colour in her face changed in the way colour changes when a person understands, in a single moment, the complete shape of what has just happened to them. "I'd like a complete patient log for today's intake from 7 a.m. onward," Nadine said. "Please have it ready within the hour." She picked up the identification card and placed it back in the plastic bag, and she turned and walked with Dr. Morrow through the double doors into the interior of the hospital. The doors swung closed behind them. In the waiting room, 3 people who had been watching looked at each other without speaking. The corridor beyond the doors was long and painted a pale institutional green that Nadine suspected had not changed since the hospital's last renovation in 2007. She noted it. She noted the paint condition, the overhead lighting, 2 fixtures with burned-out bulbs in the first 20 feet, a supply cart parked against the wall at an angle that blocked approximately a third of the corridor width, a telephone mounted to the wall with a handset dangling by its cord against the baseboard. She noted the time on the wall clock as she passed it, 12:42. She noted the floor, a linoleum tile in a beige-grey pattern, clean but scuffed near the corridor's centre where foot traffic concentrated, the kind of scuffing that came not from neglect but from volume, from years of people moving through the same narrow channel and the channel never being wide enough. She noted the absence of wayfinding signage past the first intersection, the point at which a patient navigating alone would face 3 unmarked turns, and no guidance. She wrote 2 lines in the notebook as she walked. Morrow, beside her, said nothing. She respected that. "Walk me through cardiology intake," she said. He did. They spent 35 minutes in the department. He showed her the intake desk, the waiting area, the communication protocol between the floor and emergency admissions, the system used to flag priority referrals. He showed her the log where his referral for Nadine had been entered at 9:15 that morning, 2.5 hours before she had arrived, with a priority designation that should have triggered immediate notification to emergency triage. The notification had not been sent. "The system sends an automated alert," Morrow said. "It should have gone to triage at 9:15. I can show you the log entry." "I'll need that log as part of the documentation," Nadine said. "Of course." "Who manages the notification protocols for the integration between cardiology intake and emergency triage?" He paused. "Operationally, that falls under the emergency department's administrative director." "Who is?" Another pause. "Patricia Voss. She's been in the role for 3 years." Nadine wrote the name in her notebook. They moved through the rest of the department methodically. Nadine asked precise questions and Morrow answered them with equal precision. She spoke to 2 intake coordinators, a woman named Gwen, who had been with the department for 11 years and who described the notification gap with the quiet exhaustion of someone who had named a problem so many times that the naming had become its own kind of weight, and a younger man, Marcus, who had started in the department 8 months ago and who confirmed, without being prompted, that he had never received training on the priority referral integration system, because he said he had been told the documentation was being updated. She wrote Gwen's name. She wrote Marcus's name. She wrote documentation being updated and the date. By the time they reached the end of the walkthrough, she had 14 pages of new notes and a clear picture of a department that was performing at a high clinical level and being strangled, slowly by administrative failures that existed 3 floors away and had been allowed to accumulate for reasons she would spend the next several days tracing to their origins. At 2:15, they sat in Morrow's office, a small room with 2 windows overlooking the parking structure and a wall of framed credentials that Nadine did not look at because she was not impressed by frames. She was impressed by what people did on the days when nothing watched them. His desk had 3 stacks of files and a coffee mug that had been used and not washed, and a small framed photograph turned toward him that she did not examine. There was also a clear plastic paperweight with a small compass embedded in it, the kind sold at airport gift shops, the needle pointing north, and Nadine looked at it for a moment and then looked away. "The letter," she said. "You mentioned in it that you had raised the intake issue through internal channels before writing to the board." 3 times, he said. Once verbally to the department heads committee, once in a written memo to the administrative director, once in a formal quality improvement filing that went through compliance. Each one was acknowledged, and each one was closed without action. Closed on what basis? The verbal one was noted in the meeting minutes as under review. The memo was responded to with a reference to a process improvement initiative that had been initiated in 2021 and was described as ongoing. The QI filing was closed with a notation that the reported issue did not meet the threshold for mandatory corrective action. Nadine wrote this down. She wrote the words threshold and corrective action and underlined them. "Do you have copies of all 3 responses?" "Yes." "I'll need them." "They're already scanned," he said. "I've had them ready since January." She looked at him across the desk. He had the look of a person who had been preparing for this conversation for a long time and had not allowed himself to believe it would actually happen. And now that it was happening, he was holding himself very still, the way people hold still when they are afraid that movement will break something fragile. "Dr. Morrow," she said, "I want to be clear with you about something. This audit is not going to produce a summary report that goes into a file. The board asked me to conduct this evaluation because the pattern of complaints across multiple departments and multiple quarters indicates a failure of operational leadership at the administrative level. What I document here is going to result in structural changes." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "How significant?" "I don't know yet. That depends on what the full documentation shows. But the events of this morning alone, what I observed in the intake area, the failure of the notification system, and the complete absence of any mechanism to flag the breakdown, those are not procedural footnotes. They are the picture." He nodded once. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Not for the audit, for my own understanding." "All right. Why a letter after 3 internal attempts? Why go to the board directly rather than continuing through the chain?" He was quiet for a moment. He picked up the compass paperweight and turned it in his hand without looking at it. "Because a patient died in January," he said. "A 72-year-old man named Arthur Pennington, who presented at emergency intake with chest pain and was triaged as non-urgent and waited 3 hours and 14 minutes before he was brought back, and he died of a myocardial infarction in that waiting room. And the internal review concluded that the triage assessment was within standard parameters." He set the paperweight down. "I disagreed with that conclusion. I disagreed with it very strongly. And I understood at that point that the internal review process was not going to produce the result that Arthur Pennington deserved. So I wrote the letter." Nadine held what he had said in the room for a moment. She did not tell him she was sorry. She did not offer the phrase. It was one of the things she had learned from her mother, who had survived a great deal by refusing to treat grief as something that needed to be managed or redirected. You let it be what it was. You did not dress it up. She wrote Arthur Pennington's name in her notebook. She wrote the date, January. She wrote 3 hours and 14 minutes. She circled it. "That name," she said. "Is he in the incident documentation?" "Yes, file number IR-2024-0117. She wrote that down too. They worked for another hour. Morrow's assistant brought coffee that Nadine drank because it was offered and because she had been in the hospital since 9:45 and it was now past 3 in the afternoon and she had eaten nothing. She drank it without tasting it, the way she drank coffee when she was working, as a function rather than a pleasure. By 4 o'clock, she had a complete initial inventory of what the audit would require and a clear understanding of where the structural failures were concentrated. The picture was not complicated. It was a pattern she had seen before in other hospitals, in other administrative configurations. A clinical department operating at a high level. An administrative layer that had become, over several years, insulated from accountability through a combination of personnel stability, process complexity, and the particular institutional blindness that develops when the people responsible for oversight and the people being overseen share the same professional networks and the same quarterly review cycles. Nobody had checked. Nadine understood this. She had seen it produce tragedy before. It would produce tragedy again somewhere else, in some other hospital, where the administrative layer had grown comfortable, and the people who noticed problems were the ones without the titles to get them solved. She had spent 33 years watching the same architecture of failure reassemble itself in different buildings with different names on the door, and the consistency of it was not discouraging to her. It was clarifying. It told her exactly where to look. She closed her notebook at 4:22. "I'll be back on Thursday," she said. "I'll need access to the administrative director's office and the compliance filing system. I'll also need a meeting with the executive leadership team. I'd recommend not announcing the nature of the meeting in advance." Morrow looked at her. "You know that's going to create a significant amount of anxiety." "Yes," she said. "It will." She stood and picked up the plastic bag. She adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder. "Dr. Morrow," she said, "the letter you wrote, I want you to know that it was read carefully, by me and by the board chair. Every page." She paused. Arthur Pennington deserved someone who would write that letter. He had one. Morrow's face did what faces do when something that has been held at a distance for a long time is finally allowed to come close. His jaw moved. He looked at the desk for a moment and then looked back at her. "Thank you," he said. It was a small sentence. It carried a great deal of weight. She nodded once and left. The hotel was 12 minutes from the hospital. She checked in, set her bag on the desk in the room, and sat at the desk window for 20 minutes watching the city without writing anything. Then she took out the notebook and opened it and began to organize what she had and what she still needed and what Thursday would have to accomplish. She worked until 11. The wooden cross sat at the edge of the desk where she had placed it, the way she always placed it when she worked at a desk in a hotel room, the way she had done in hotel rooms in Baltimore and Pittsburgh and Richmond and Columbus. The cross always at the edge, always visible, a small anchor in rooms that were all the same and all temporary. The grain of the wood was smooth from the years. She did not look at it often when she was working. She did not need to. She knew it was there. On Thursday she returned, as she had said she would. She arrived at 8 in the morning with a 2-person audit team from the consortium's compliance division. 2 women in their 30s named Adairs and Constance, both of whom had worked with Nadine before and understood, without being told, the pace she set and the standard she held. They carried laptops and document scanners and the particular focused quiet of people who knew exactly what they were looking at. Adairs had spent 6 years before joining the consortium as an insurance auditor, and she had the habit, useful in this work, of reading documents the way a person reads a map before a journey, looking first for what was missing. Constance had a background in nursing administration and caught things in procedural documentation that other auditors walked past. Nadine trusted them both. She had not arrived at that trust easily or quickly, but she had arrived there, and trust earned slowly holds. She went directly to the administrative director's suite on the 3rd floor. Patricia Voss was in her office when Nadine knocked. She was a woman in her early 50s with a tightly organized desk and an expression that shifted through 3 different configurations in the 3 seconds between Nadine appearing in the doorway and Nadine placing the consortium identification on the desk between them. Nadine introduced herself and Adairs and Constance. She explained the purpose of the visit. She used precise language and no softening. She told Voss what they needed access to and the timeline in which they needed it. Voss said, "I wasn't notified of an audit." "That's correct," Nadine said. "You were not." Voss's hands had been resting on her desk. They did not move, but something in their stillness changed. "I'll need to contact our legal office." "You're welcome to do that," Nadine said. "The consortium's authority to conduct unannounced operational audits of member hospitals is in the governance agreement your CEO signed in 2019. The relevant section is 19C. Your legal office will have it." She paused. "I'll need the compliance filing archive and the administrative integration logs for 2022 through present. Your team can begin pulling those while you make your call." Voss looked at her for a long moment, then she reached for her phone. The meeting with the executive leadership team happened at 10. There were 7 people in the room, including the hospital CEO, a man named Robert Keane, who had been in the role for 6 years and who had the manner of someone accustomed to being the most senior person present. He was not, today, the most senior person present. Nadine walked them through the preliminary findings in 45 minutes, using the documentation she and her team had already compiled. She was specific. She cited dates, file numbers, incident logs, and the gap, which she described as a systemic and unaddressed failure of the notification integration between cardiology intake and emergency triage. She described what she had personally observed on Tuesday morning. She described it without editorializing and without omitting any detail, including the exchange at the triage window and the 3 separate dismissals she had witnessed before identifying herself. The room was very quiet. Robert Keane said, "Ms. Okafor, I want to assure you that this institution takes these findings very seriously and that we will cooperate fully." "I know you will," Nadine said. She did not say it unkindly. She said it as a fact. "The cooperation isn't what concerns me. What concerns me is that the mechanisms for internal escalation were present and functional and were used 3 times by a senior physician and produced no corrective action. I'll need to understand how that happened before I can recommend what needs to change structurally. That investigation will take several weeks." "Of course," Keane said. She looked around the table. "I also want to say directly that the clinical care in this hospital's cardiology department is excellent. Dr. Morrow and his team are doing the work this institution should be proud of. The failures I'm documenting are administrative failures. That distinction matters because it means the path to correction runs through this side of the table, not through his department." Nobody looked at each other. They looked at Nadine, or they looked at the table. "One more thing," she said. She opened her notebook to the page where she had written Arthur Pennington's name. She said the name aloud. She said his age. She said the date. She said 3 hours and 14 minutes. She said that his case had been reviewed internally and closed without correction. And she said that the notification failure her team had documented this week was consistent with the conditions that had contributed to his outcome. She closed the notebook. "He's part of this record," she said. "He stays in it." She left the room at 11:22. The audit ran for 3 weeks. Adair and Constance were joined in week 2 by 2 members of the consortium's Quality Improvement Division, and by the end of the 3rd week the documentation filled 4 binders, each one tabbed and indexed in Adair's precise system, with a digital archive that mirrored the binders exactly. Every document had a file number. Every file number had a corresponding entry in the master index. Every index entry had been cross-referenced against the source material. Nadine reviewed everything herself. She reviewed it in the evenings at the hotel, reading at the desk by the window with the wooden cross at the edge of the desk, going through the binders in order, marking pages with a fine point pen in the margin, a single vertical line for things that needed to appear in the report, and a small circle for things that needed to be named specifically, and a double mark for things that she would personally verify in person before the report was finalised. She had a lot of double marks. The findings were not surprising in their content, they were clarifying in their specificity. The notification integration failure had been introduced in March of 2022 and had never been tested end-to-end. The testing had been assigned to a contractor who had documented the assignment as complete without performing it, and the documentation had been accepted without verification. The gap had been present for 27 months before Morrow's first internal filing. The 3 internal filings had each been reviewed by members of Voss's administrative team, and each one had been closed at the department level before reaching executive leadership in direct violation of the consortium's own QI protocol, which required that filings from senior physicians be escalated to the executive director automatically after 30 days without resolution. The protocol had existed. It had not been followed. In the audit report's final section, under the heading Accountability and Corrective Action, Nadine wrote 12 pages. They were the most precise 12 pages she had ever written. She described what had failed and where and who had been responsible at each point. She did not use language designed to blunt the conclusions. She used language designed to be understood. The report went to the board on a Wednesday morning. By the following Monday, Patricia Voss had resigned, which was the word the consortium's communications office used, though Nadine understood the word in context. The notification integration was placed under emergency remediation, with a 90-day correction timeline and weekly reporting to Nadine's office. The triage desk protocols were suspended pending a full rewrite under a joint committee that included Morrow's department and 2 external patient advocates. C. Hartwell, the nurse at the triage window, was placed on administrative review. Nadine had been precise in the audit about what she had personally observed at that window, and she had been equally precise in noting that Hartwell's behaviour, while representative of a broader systemic failure, was also a failure of individual professional conduct. The review would determine appropriate outcome. That was the process. Nadine trusted the process and also documented it, which was, she had found, a more reliable combination than trust alone. Morrow called her on the Tuesday after the board meeting. "The board chair called me this morning," he said. "I know," she said. "He said the consortium is funding the creation of a patient experience review office in the emergency department, reporting directly to the COO's office." "That's correct." "He said you recommended that it be named the Pennington Patient Advocacy Office." Nadine was quiet for a moment. Outside the hotel window, the city moved through its afternoon the way cities do, without pause, without ceremony. "Arthur Pennington came to that hospital seeking care," she said. "He deserved to receive it. The least the institution can do is carry his name as a reminder of what it owes the people who walk through its doors." Morrow did not respond immediately. When he did, his voice had changed in the way voices change when the distance between what someone has hoped for and what has actually happened finally closes. "I think he would have been glad," he said. She thought about this. She thought about a man she had never met, who had sat in a waiting room chair in January, who had been alone with a chest that ached, who had waited and not been seen in time. She thought about her mother, who had also waited in rooms and not been seen, though in different rooms and for different reasons, and who had died 7 years ago in a hospital bed in Silver Spring, with Nadine holding her hand and the wooden cross between their palms. "I think so too," she said. She flew home on Friday. She drove herself from the airport in the early evening, through the city traffic that was familiar and slow, and she did not think about the audit or the report or the board meeting or Hartwell or Voss or any of it. She thought about her mother's voice. The way Comfort Okafor had said the names of things, the ventricles and the valves and the chambers, as if naming them carefully was the same as caring for them. She parked in her driveway and sat for a moment in the quiet of the car and reached into the plastic bag and held the wooden cross and felt the grain of it under her thumb. 34 years of being carried. The wood had smoothed where hands had held it, worn down to a specific warmth that was partly the material and partly time. And Nadine knew that the warmth was not hers alone. It had been her mother's before it was hers, and before that it had belonged to the hands of whoever had carved it, and one day it would belong to someone else's hands, and the chain of that inheritance was itself a form of argument about what endures and what does not. What endures is the act of looking, the refusal to look away. She got out of the car and went inside. "Here is what I want you to carry with you from this story. Not the audit, not the report, not the accountability that finally, after too long, arrived. Those things matter. They are real. But the thing underneath them, the thing that made them possible, was simpler and older and harder to systematize. It was a woman who stood at a window for the 3rd time and did not leave. It was a physician who wrote a letter when everyone around him had decided the silence was acceptable. It was a name spoken aloud in a conference room by someone who did not have to speak it, who could have let it remain a file number, but understood that the only thing standing between a person's death and its disappearance into administrative language is another person who refuses to let the language win. Arthur Pennington's name is now on a door in a hospital that failed him. That door opens every morning. People walk through it, seeking help, and on the other side of it, there is a process designed to catch what used to fall through. It is not enough. It is not close to enough. But it is a door with his name on it, and every person who reads that name is reading a reminder of what it costs when institutions treat the act of witnessing as optional. Comfort Okafor taught her daughter the names of the chambers of the heart. She never made it to the licensing exam. The $90 always went somewhere more urgent. But her daughter learned the names and learned also something harder to teach, that the names of things carry within them the obligation to protect the things they name, and that this obligation does not expire and cannot be filed away. If someone you know has ever sat in a room and not been seen, you already understand what this story is about. If you've ever been that person, I don't need to tell you the weight of being dismissed by someone who was supposed to help. And if you've ever been the one who turned back and knocked on the window one more time, who wrote the letter, who said the name aloud in a room full of people who would have preferred the silence, then you know exactly what kind of person makes institutions better than they want to be. Those people are why any of it works at all. If this story found you, share it with someone who needs to hear that persistence without cruelty is still the most powerful thing a person carries into any room.